Welcome to the Voice to Parliament Facebook Live session. So we're hoping to provide you with some information, answer some questions. We of course have a few weeks to go to the upcoming referendum, and we really want to make sure that everyone understands, because this decision is a really important decision. So thank you to the team at Northern Beaches Mums for having us and for giving us this opportunity to talk and convey the message to so many of you. So I'm Zali Steggall. I'm the federal member for Warringah, and I have it's an incredible privilege to represent our beautiful area in Parliament in Canberra. Of course, this is a major issue that's been dominating the Parliament this year, with the referendum coming up on the 14th of October. And from my point of view, I think it's really important that everyone understand the decision they're making. Now, I'm a community independent. I'm not aligned to a political party, and so for me, I've really been looking at this question on its merits and on the basis of what we can achieve with this. But very importantly, I would like to welcome Chloe Wighton. Chloe is a Wiradjuri Galari woman. She's an archaeologist and also a mum in Sydney's north. She's working closely with the Yes 23 campaign, and over the next hour we're going to be talking about the voice, the referendum, what it is and what it isn't, and we'll be answering some of your questions. So first of all, though, I think Chloe, to do an acknowledgement of country.
Thank you, Zali. Yes, look, I would like to acknowledge country, pay my respect to the elders past and present, both on country here on the Northern Beaches, but also across all of coastal Sydney, and really pay my respects to the people, the ancestors and the leaders today who continue to care for country and really lead our communities. It's such an important thing, and I'm incredibly blessed to live and work here in Sydney. So I will acknowledge country, and also, thank the Northern Beaches and Zali and our office and all of the community who actually, support Indigenous leaders here and look after our country alongside us. So thank you.
Thank you. It's so special. I've got to say, it's always so amazing. I do a lot of bush running around some of our beautiful national parks, and the history and the cultural heritage is just amazing. Yes. And I get that sense of being on country, yes, which is just incredible. And sometimes you run out to headlands and you see these carvings that are thousands and thousands of years old, and to me it's just so grounding, and it's just such a pause for reflection of the history and the length of time Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been here and on this continent, and for me it's just a real moment of awe. But tonight, so what we're hoping to cover in the session is, where did the idea of the Voice to Parliament come from, right? Because this is not new, it has been building for a long time, and it's very important for everyone to understand that. What is the question that's going to be asked of everyone at the ballot box in the referendum? And what does that question mean? What does it refer to? So that's what is the constitutional amendment that will come about along with the outcome of the referendum, and also understanding the Constitution, because unless people have studied law, most people have never read the Constitution. I've got to say, until I studied law, I never had either. And it's probably not the document most people think it is, right? So people often think what they see on TV is what's real life, and it's not quite that. So I want to talk people through the Constitution a little bit, and this is it. This is a pocket edition of the Constitution, not nearly as big or a big kind of book that people would think it is. And then why the nature of the amendment, and then why it's so important, because I think it's really for people to understand the merit, but also the significance of the decision that they're going to be asked to do. And then how does a referendum work, and how do we get it up and going? So, okay, so where did why the referendum? Where did the Voice to Parliament come from? Chloe, it started with the Uluru Statement, and we've got a beautiful copy here behind us with that amazing artwork and all those incredible signatures.
That's amazing.
And I know I've sent out copies of the Uluru Statement to all the households in the electorate, because I think it's really important for everyone to read it, because it's a very generous invitation.
It is, it is.
So tell us a bit about it.
So look, it was a really comprehensive consultation process that took place, over 13 regional dialogues, over 1,200 First Nations people participated, and it really is a beautiful invitation to the entire nation to come on this journey with us. And obviously, it focused on voice, treaty, truth, and obviously we're looking at what a voice might look like here in Australia now. But it's also really important to note that this call for constitutional recognition has been campaigned for decades in all parts of the country. We can look at the bark petitions from the Yolngu people. It's something that has been consistently on the table, and so it's a really wonderful moment now that we have in front of us on the 14th of October to actually realise what that could look like in Australia.
Absolutely. I mean, it was 2017, so it's some years ago already that the Uluru statement and that incredible invitation was made. And there's been a lot of discussion and debate, but it's finally time that, if I can use the sporting analogy, we're on the start line and we have to, get in there and do this and respond to that generous invitation. So the question in how do we give that effect? I think there's some major issues around our constitution is not a perfect document, right? I think people have to understand that the constitution is an imperfect document, but so the only way we can change it is with a referendum. So we'll get to the technicalities in a minute, but first the referendum. So everyone will be asked a question on a ballot paper, and it will be a proposed law to alter the constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? Yes or no? And people will need to write yes or no in that ballot box. So it's very important people understand that. Now, what the outcome of the question will mean is there will be an additional chapter inserted into the Constitution if the referendum is successful. So I guess it's really important to understand what that amendment looks like. Now, I can't do any screen sharing with Facebook Live, so I can't show you exactly all the words, but what's really important is that the Constitution, so there will be a small additional section to the Constitution, and it essentially contains two parts. It will mean that we recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the First Peoples of Australia and their incredibly long 65,000 years of continuous history. And like I said, when you walk around, our area is incredibly rich with those markings, carvings, so many things. And I think we kind of take it for granted, but now's the time to give it that more thorough recognition. And it would be the first instance of Indigenous and constitutional recognition in Australia in the Constitution. And because we need to remember, First Nations peoples were not recognised as citizens of Australia when the Constitution took effect in 1901. So some 65,000 years of history was not mentioned, not acknowledged, they were not consulted, they simply were not recognised. And that's a real fouling of this document. So when we want to talk about our Constitution as being, the birth document, of our nation, it is incomplete. And here is our opportunity to complete it. And I think that's really important to understand that it was never intended to be a document frozen in time, right? This is not something that's done in the past that you never change. It has a mechanism to be amended and updated, right? 1901, it was only men really around the table writing this document. Women were not consulted either. And so it's important that we update it. Now, the second part of the constitutional amendment will be that in recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the First Peoples of Australia, we will do so by recognising a voice, by giving them a voice to the Parliament and to the Executive. Now, what that is an elected body of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who will have the opportunity to express opinions to the Parliament and to the government and the executive of the day. That's all. They may make representations. They are the words, very specific in the alteration, and may make representations. It's not even advice, right? Because there was a lot of debate over, legalities of all of this, and to keep it meaningful, effective, but not too scary, for people, I guess is the best way to say. These words have been chosen really, really carefully, right? As a lawyer, I can promise you, when they select words, they select every comma, every word has been weighed and assessed to be effective, but not an overreach or not cause unintended consequences. And then lastly, very importantly, the Parliament and the government of the day retains the right to make the laws and set out the laws in relation to the voice. So it's very important that the elected government, so the role of our democracy, is not usurped in any way. The government remains the primacy in terms of the decision making. So I think that's a really important one. And also, the voice may make representations on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's really important that we focus on this, because I've sat in Parliament now for 4 years and I've listened to Closing the Gap statements for 4 years, and you feel like crying in Parliament when you hear these statements, because they're terrible. They're terrible. For Indigenous youth, for outcomes, for life expectancy, for health, it's not working. So for me, this is these are very much the focus. So would you like to talk, Chloe, about the voice?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's to pick up on the Closing the Gap targets. Look, we know government and politicians have had a go at this, and it's not working. There's 19 Closing the Gap targets and just 4 are on track. Look, I think we can do better than that. And I have no doubt that the Australian people come the 14th of October will absolutely get behind and vote yes. But also the other thing to speak to the voice and some of the principles around what that will look like. We know that it will be independent of government, which is really important. And it will be chosen by Indigenous people, which is also,
and
really
elected.
important.
But they will be elected.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it will be representative of the community, so it won't be sort of an overarching mechanism. It will be representative of localised communities and is also the states as well. We also are looking for a gender balanced representation here as well, which is really important in community, absolutely.
So equal men and women?
Yes, and also making sure that we are including young people in this as well, which is really, really important for our communities. When we look at, at our the demographics in our community and the huge population of young people and what young people need in our communities, it's hugely important. And like any advisory committee, it will be transparent and accountable, and that is what we're asking for through the voice, is that we want to be accountable for our communities. We want to take responsibility for what works and what doesn't work, and I think this is a really wonderful mechanism to do that.
Yeah, it really is. It's simple but effective. And if I could say, as a parliamentarian, I've had a number of times where I've had to make decisions on pieces of legislation, and the real difficulty I have is that if I go, for example, to in the last Parliament I went to Ken Wyatt and he would give me the coalition line, and then I went to Linda Burney and she gave me the Labor line, and it's very difficult to get the independent advice on the effect of a policy on the ground in community, especially where it's a very targeted policy decision, for example. And so for me, in making decisions on behalf of Warringah on pieces of legislation, incredibly important to have access to that advice, to that opinion around what will be good law and what won't be, what will be effective and what will be what won't work.
Absolutely.
So it's really important to understand that. Like, for me as a parliamentarian, I see a very like an ethical reason, but also a very practical reason in the voice. So I guess, let's have a look at our constitution, right? Because a lot of people worry about, I know, for example, No Campaign have talked about it being risky, or, locking it into the constitution, is that a problem? So the constitution, as I said, not a big document. It's essentially the document of, it's a power sharing document that all our state governments agreed to in deciding to create the federal government and become, the Australia that we know. And in that sharing of power document, they were deciding what powers the federal government would have and what powers the state government would have. So state MPs, for example, education and health and roads. Federal taxes, treaties, national policies, protecting the environment, bigger other things. So they're the kind of things. And so, for example, in the Constitution, there's a provision that the Parliament and the government may make powers in relation to our Defence Force, or to our taxes, or to setting up our federal courts. Now, the detail is not in the Constitution. The detail is determined by the laws that governments pass, and Parliament to Parliament tweak them, change them, depends on who's in power and who makes, But if you think about all the laws we have about taxes, for example, they are not in the Constitution. But you need to appoint the power to have that ability. And so that is what this constitutional amendment or alteration is proposing, is simply saying that we recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first Australians, but secondly, that there will, and we do so respectfully, by giving them a voice on issues that impact them. The rest is determined by the government of the day, as we do for every other issue, from defence to taxes to our courts, right? So it's really important that we look at that. And some of the argument that's been raised that there might be High Court challenges or decisions about that, that has been completely discredited by the Solicitor General, has issued an advice pointing out that that is not a case. We have had leading retired High Court judges who have all come on the record to say, no, that is not a risk. We've had leading Queen's Counsels, so leading silks, constitutional lawyers. Brett Walker is one of our most senior constitutional barristers, come out and say, no, he completely rejects that there is any risk of, court and challenge to the government. And I should say on this point, other nations have constitutional recognition and processes like this. In fact, if you look at Canada or New Zealand, and now they do not have a situation, they're much further ahead than us. They have treaties and other things in place, but that takes a long time. We are on our first step of the journey. Well, I guess it's the next step of reconciliation that we really need to talk about. So I guess for everyone, is there anything else you wanted to talk about when it comes to the voice and how it will be effective?
Look, I think it's one of those things where, again, we look at the closing the gap targets. We understand that there's a lot of work to do. But I think the incredible thing about having a mechanism that allows for localised advice and localised recommendation and feedback means that we understand what's happening on the ground. And look, Indigenous communities understand what works and what doesn't. We know that when we listen to Indigenous communities, governments can make better decisions. There's a real case to be made around the money, the dollars. We know that governments spend, billions of dollars every year for very little outcome. We want to get the right advice to allow governments to make sure the funding goes where it needs to go, so it gets down to where it needs to be to make practical change. And look, I think that it's going to be something that, well, I know that it's going to be something that's going to target the really critical areas like housing, education, employment and health. These are really big issues in our communities, and I'm really looking forward to be able to realise the day when we can hear directly from our communities that are impacted the most.
Yeah, because there is so many amazing on the ground projects and community organisations that are doing great work with kids, with women, with children, but sometimes they're so localised, it's very hard for them to be heard in Canberra. to understand that that is the kind of program that needs to be rolled out more, or that needs to be, get more support. And so it really will bring so much more effectiveness, efficiency, because it's getting that, it will be able to give that opinion. And it's important to know the voice will not have any decision-making power over programs or policy, or control any money. So it's really there to give feedback to the government to make sure things are more effective. So for me as a parliamentarian, I just absolutely will welcome it, because I think it will make a huge difference. Now, how does a referendum work? Because this is the complex thing. Whilst this document, it was not intended to be frozen in time, they didn't make it easy for it to be changed. So for a referendum to work, it needs to have a double majority. So that means we need the majority of Australians across the whole country to vote in support, and then we need 4 out of 6 of the states to vote again. So it's really that reminder that our constitution was written by state governments when they were sort of creating federation. So the territories, Northern Territory and the ACT, they count in the first limb but not in the second. So very important to talk to your family and friends, and reach out to people that might be outside of Warringah to see how, do they need more information, how are they feeling about it. Every vote will count and will matter. So it's very important. Absolutely. We need everywhere to be good. It is hard for referendums to be successful, though. I think we've, out of 19 referendums in Australia since 1901, and they've proposed 44 changes, only 8 changes have been agreed on. So it shows how hard it is. But that doesn't, but it's important to try. And that's why keeping it as simple as possible is very important. So the more complex a proposed question or change is, the less likely it is to get up. So that's why keeping it as simple as possible is really important. Now, even though those statistics around referendums aren't great, I'm a glass half full kind of person, and I do feel that Australia, we are on a reconciliation journey. We can't change the past, but we can't ignore the past either. And we all have that responsibility to think about what kind of future do we want. What's our next step? We've got an opportunity on the 14th of October to write the next chapter of Australian history. And so what one is it going to be is really, really important. And I think it's so important for everyone to feel heard.
Yes.
I think, so one of the arguments that comes up is that there are already Indigenous parliamentarians. Isn't that enough to cover those issues? I guess from my perspective, observing that is everyone is polarised by their political party, right? Everyone that is in Parliament is on one side or the other. There are no actually, we need some independence. That's what we need. But everyone is polarised by their political party. And so the response to a certain policy issue is dictated by the party room.
I hear that question a lot, and I think the thing that we need to remember is that it's wonderful that we have 11 Indigenous parliamentarians. It's absolutely wonderful, but they are elected by their constituents and represent their electorates, which is an incredible job to start with. And we understand that they don't represent all of the areas and all of the communities that are impacted really heavily by some of these issues. Yes. So allowing a voice to sort of provide feedback means that everyone in Parliament can make better decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. To me, I find it's an interesting argument, because it's like saying I can only. I think everyone's got to be there to represent the community. The decisions we make in Parliament, we make them with the best interest to represent the views of our community, but then we also have to think of Australia as a whole and what is going to be for the greater good of the nation in those decisions we make. And that's why it's so important to have
that independent advice.
The feedback is incredibly important. Now, we've touched on them a little bit, the closing the gaps. And I think we can't stress them enough, because sometimes here in Warringah, I think we're a bit removed from sometimes some of the challenges that can be faced in communities. And if anyone's read the Uluru Statement, Indigenous youth is the most over-incarcerated in the world. Now, just, reflect on that statement for a minute, that we're talking about, of all the countries around the world, proportionally to population, the most incarcerated. Now, why? There is something fundamentally wrong in our system for that to be happening. And some of the statistics are just horrible in terms of life expectancy, over 8 years less. And that has an impact for people when it comes to, accessing your superannuation, for example. What should be the retirement age if your life expectancy is so much shorter. Suicide rate, 2 times higher than non-Indigenous. Now that's a major problem, right? We all worry about mental health and suicide. Youth incarceration, like I said, horrendously high, just terrible. Homelessness, and then, I really feel strongly that I really want to see women having more voice. Absolutely. And so for me, that fact that there will be a 50-50 makeup in the voice of men and women, to me, really important to have that representation. I think, you're a mum, worrying about our kids' future is just, it's such a part of it. And to think that in some communities, Indigenous children are more likely to go to prison than to finish school.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just hard to, I think it's hard sometimes to wrap our head around, and it's such an insidious problem. And if programs aren't working and policies aren't working, we're not going to fix this. And there has to be agency around it. So I think, it's I do feel so much that we can do this. Because a lot of people want to know, will it make a difference, right? How will the voice make a difference? Because it's a modest change, but it is significant. I think it's that bit around constitutional recognition and effective opinions and advice. It's effective.
And look, I think it's worth noting that not all Indigenous people support the voice to Parliament. I absolutely respect that, and that's quite literally a reflection of the diversity in our communities. And there's no other group in this country where you would expect unanimous agreement. It's just not realistic. And so, but I do think that we need to pay very close attention to the 80% of Indigenous people who do support this. That is a huge number. The overwhelming majority, and so that's incredible. Look, I think when we talk about practical change, we're talking about communities that, I was out in Walgett last week. That's where my kids come from. My kid's father comes from, and their family. You can't drink the water there. It's bore water. It's 2023, and then we look at the rates of diabetes and the the really critical health problems in these remote or far west communities here in New South Wales. I'm from a town of about 3,000 people, Gilgandra, and we're looking at kids who don't have any sort of prospects of a job after school because there are none, or it's seasonal, and so it's really difficult in communities to be able to, we kind of say if you can't see it, you can't be it. So there is a real problem with what we're offering as opportunities for our young people. But we understand as well that there are some really wonderful things happening in communities. But we know as well with the changing governments, sometimes the goalposts change. And that means service delivery might change, it means programs might be cut or slightly altered, that then means that it doesn't meet the need on the ground, which is really unfortunate, and it happens time and time again. I think that this, again with the permanency of the Constitution, it means that it's there to stay. It means that there won't be sort of a, swept under the rug with a new government. Our feedback remains. We have the mechanism to give feedback no matter what. It doesn't matter who is in government, we have that mechanism, which I think is a really important thing for our communities. And so look, I really think that this is going to allow for us to really have real and tangible sort of feedback for government to make better decisions, and that's what this is about.
And I think it's important for people to think about that. Often people fear change, or they worry about what its impact will be on ourselves, right? But the reality is, this will not impact most of us. This is a change that will impact the lives of others that are incredibly disadvantaged. And Australia has caused that disadvantage, right? We have. And so it does need to be addressed. But this will not impact the vast majority of Australians. This is absolutely, and I really challenge that fear some people have of, well, it's not really is it going to impact me, so I'm not sure. This is really something that you're generously doing for others. It will not take anything away.
And there's a lot of noise. I mean, when you cut through it, people aren't going to lose their backyards. The beaches won't close. Look, this is really just about an advisory committee.
Yes.
A simple advisory committee, and it's about listening to Indigenous people. Yes. That is all it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point. People say they support constitutional recognition, but then they raise all these kind of objections to the voice. But if you accept constitutional recognition, then the question I have for everyone is, do you want that to be tokenistic, or do you want that to be meaningful? And if you want that to be meaningful and respectful, then the Uluru Statement, the process, has asked that constitutional recognition be done by way of a voice, so that they can be heard. And so to me, that is how we make it meaningful.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so important. Now, there's some exciting people that have come out in support of the referendum, and you actually were there. So obviously, I'm a bit older than you. I was, my sporting days were back in the late 90s, but I remember the Sydney Olympics vividly, because it was, I had won my bronze medal in the 98 Olympics. So for me, coming to the Sydney Olympics and doing the torch relay, and I've actually got my torch from the Sydney Olympics just there, it was huge, right? I remember the excitement around Sydney. And when Kathy Freeman won, first when she lit the cauldron at the opening ceremony, and then when she won her gold medal, it was huge. It was such a moment of just unifying. She did her lap of honour with the Australian flag and the Aboriginal flag. She had her shoes with her colour. She was such a symbol of hope and reconciliation and courage, right, in doing what she did. Now, you were there when she came out.
Yeah, so Kathy has again been really strong and thrown her support behind the Yes 23 campaign, and she crafted an absolutely beautiful and warm piece to camera a few weeks ago that went live this week, and it was really quite an incredible moment, almost emotional moment, to hear her speak in that way, because it meant so much to her. And I mean, I think when the country looks back on that moment, it's one of those moments where you go, oh, that's really, really special. And I think actually on our doorstep now,
we
have another moment that we will look back as a country and go, we are so proud that we did that. Yeah. It's going to be a unifying moment. I think it's going to lead to a better, more reconciled country, and something that we're really proud of.
Yeah, I know. That's I still get tears, and I watched that footage from the Olympics, and Australians are really good at feeling, coming together in moments in time in history where you have that opportunity to step up. Or are you going to step up and be brave, or are you going to step back and hold back? And
absolutely,
we have always gone forward, and I think that's the beauty of Australia, that we are, that we are we have a modern nation. We are, and we are a multicultural nation. But with such an incredible history, that when you think of 65,000 years.
Yeah, I was in far west New South Wales last week, and in Dubbo on my way back, and the overwhelming sort of conversations that we're having on the ground are with people who, you know, may not have turned their minds to this yet for, you know, a number of different reasons. They might not have a radio, or they might not, you know, be tapped into social media. And there is this really beautiful sort of a fair dinkum, straight down the line attitude out there. I mean, I think it's true in the entire country, but especially so in the bush, where when people heard about the simple proposition that was on the table, the response was, let's get it done. Let's get on with it. Yeah. And I think that is such an encouraging thing to hear every day. Every day we heard that. And so I'm really confident that the Australian people, you know, we come together when we need to the most. We absolutely do. And I think this will be another moment where we'll see that. Yeah,
and also I think about it for our kids, that we've got to fix this, right? And if we don't do it now, we are leaving this problem for more. You know, that this is a step we haven't been brave enough, that we can be brave enough to take. Now, what's important though is, and it has been said, is a lot of misinformation about this. So even the official booklet from the government, so this is paid for by your taxpayer dollars, is not fact-checked. So I did try to introduce a law around truth in political advertising and referendums, but the government did not want to introduce that in time. So as a result, there's no fact-checking. So each side can put their case to you. And quite outlandish things can be put to you, and there's, you know, and sometimes the more outlandish the proposition, the more, you know, it's really often lies to create fear, because fear is an easy emotion to draw from people. So I'd encourage everyone, if you've got questions, please write in or go to some of the websites. There's a lot of really good sites to go and do that. The government website is www.voice.gov.au. Of course, please contact my office if you would like a copy of the Constitution, a copy of the amendments, or anything like that. So that's www.zalisteggall.com.au/Warringah_voice. Or there is some also information at www.yes23.com.au. Now, we've got some questions from some of you, so we're going to tackle some of those questions, and they've been monitored on the screen, so here we are. Why is there not a voice already? Well, Chloe?
Yeah, well, look, it's one of those things that, like Zali sort of mentioned earlier, a referendum is quite a challenging task to get up. Yes. Logistically, but also it's you know, something that's been called for in a number of different communities across this country for a very long time. So the fact that we were able not that long ago with the Uluru Statement of the Heart to have a unified invitation to the nation was quite an important moment. And look, I think that, you know, Indigenous communities have tried for, you know, many years through many different sort of avenues to be able to impact change, and, you know, we continue to do that, but the voice, particularly through constitutional recognition, needs to happen via referendum, which, you know, just doesn't happen very often.
So it's interesting, that question, when you say why is there not a voice already. I don't know from the person who's put that question up, but is that why have we not gotten constitutional recognition already, or why not the sort of the body, the voice? It's all right. So I guess what I want to unpack is, I think we're long overdue on constitutional recognition, and overwhelmingly people say they support that. And so that's why, but it's, as I said before, it's really important to understand, how do we make that meaningful and respectful? And if we are respectful in our constitutional recognition, then we do it in the way in which it's been asked to be done.
And I think when we look at the consultation processes that happen now, again, with the changing governments, those consultation sort of mechanisms change. And so that means you're not getting consistent advice. Sometimes it's not advice that's either listened to, or, you know, it might be advice on a specific area. So sometimes it's not that we aren't consulted, it's just it may not be consistent. Yes. And that's really unfortunate. I mean, the other thing, you know, MPs, do give advice, but I think it is a two-way street, and we really need to be listening to the communities on the ground to impact and to see practical outcomes, because we know what we're doing right now isn't working.
It is also, it comes back to, it is political. At the end of the day, the decisions government does and MPs does, votes, they are political decisions. The best example I can give everyone is during the last parliament, there was the Indue Card program, which was a trial initially around controlling access to funding, to social support in certain communities. Heavily criticised because ultimately fairly discriminatory and fairly controlling, and and I had major concerns about it. When I talked to Ken Wyatt from the Coalition, he was putting it forward, he was supportive. Talked to Linda Burney, against it. And so all I could really get was a political response. I couldn't get the on the ground response, because the communities that were going to be impacted were in the Northern Territory and areas far away from Warringah. In the end, I decided to give it the benefit of the doubt for the trial period. But then at the end of the trial period, the government of the day, so the Morrison government, were asking the Parliament to make it permanent. And I said, well, hang on a minute, it was a trial. We need to see whether it's been effective, has it worked, has it delivered the changes it promised, because it was a very expensive program. There was like $10,000 in fees over every card. It was really, there was a lot of waste involved as well. So I wanted to know, is this good, effective use of money, of public money, this program? Is it a fair program? And I simply could not get the answer from the government. So the government had commissioned a report. They refused to release the report before we had to vote on the legislation, and they hadn't delivered the wraparound services that were supposed to go with the card. And so in the end, I just could not, in due faith, in good faith, support continuing the program when there wasn't the rest that went with it. Now, if there had been a voice in place, I could have gone to the voice, and they don't have skin in the game in one side of politics versus the other. They're genuinely looking at whether or not this works on the ground. So I would have had access to some feedback around, is it working or not, and what are the other things that are needed to make it work better, or how can we change it? And we just didn't have that because it's so politicised in Parliament. So to me, that impartial voice on these very specific programs is incredibly important for them to be effective and efficient. And so, don't MPs give advice? Well, I think you answered that, Chloe. Yeah, no, I don't think MPs do give advice. Well, not independent advice, not until we have independent MPs. Is probably the point. The second question we've got is, why does it have to be in the Constitution? Why not trial it first? Well, I would argue we've been trialling it since 1901.
Yeah.
Right?
And I mean, we've seen other advisory committees and boards and structures like ATSIC, like National Congress, and again, to my point earlier, with the change of government, those advisory committees and sort of boards are wiped with the stroke of a pen.
Yes.
So the consistency is not there. The Constitution offers a permanent mechanism. So it's not it's not just a piece of legislation that can be, wiped with the stroke of a pen overnight with the change of government. It means that it's a permanent a structure that, we can use to give feedback, which is really, really important.
Yeah, and I think for that, I'd bring you back to the Constitution. So the Constitution makes the power that there be a defence force. But and that's important, right? You wouldn't want there to be a new government one day that's elected and that decides, no, I don't want to spend any money on defence anymore. We no longer have a defence force. So it's always protected that there is going to be that entity, that group will be there protected. How big it is, how it changes, how often it meets, all those kind of things will depend on the government of the day. And that's it. I'm okay with that, because that means it's the will of the people kind of prevails. And if a government is doing it well, They might get support at the next election, and if a government is seen as doing it really badly, that might be one of the issues why the Australian people decide to change the government. It's the same when it comes to our taxes, to our defence, to many other issues that are in the Constitution. You can't really trial it. So constitutional recognition is in the Constitution. So we can't trial it, right? That's how it works. In terms of the advisory bodies, we have been trialling it since 1901. And I think arguably most people would agree it's not working. So I think it's time to do it differently. Now, another question. Does current wording exclude First Nations? I'm assuming that's a question referring to the Constitution. So the Constitution has been amended because, I mean, when the race has always been in the Constitution, let's be really clear. This is a very imperfect document. It was a document that specifically excluded, made particular provisions around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people where state governments could make particular laws about them. And that enabled, for example, the stolen generation, that laws were made in relation to where they could live, where they could work, whether they were allowed to marry or not, and it dictated whether they were allowed to raise their children. And I don't think any of us can even, non-Indigenous people can even begin to understand the generational trauma and the harm that has caused through generations. Now, some of that has been, I wouldn't say rectified, but has been acknowledged with the apology to the stolen generation. And I was in Canberra when we had the anniversary of the apology. But the effects are still being felt. It takes generations, and that's why these closing the gap statements and policies are so important. It took until 1967, which is insane, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be recognised in the Constitution, to be recognised as citizens of Australia entitled to a vote. Keep in mind, everyone, we had First Nations soldiers in World War I and World War II, right? And they had equity and equality while they were fighting. They received payment like other soldiers. But when they came back from World War II, they did not get the support that other veterans got. They were treated differently. But we were happy for them to go and fight for Australia. But they were fighting for an Australia that didn't even recognise them. So I think it's really important for everyone to be aware of that history and that inequity. So I guess in relation to the Voice, who will elect the members of the Voice, the body, and how many will be on committee? Well, who will elect?
Yeah, well, so it's going to be elected by Indigenous people for Indigenous people, absolutely. But once we secure a successful yes vote, it will then be the government's job to sort of undertake a parliamentary process to understand what that looks like, how that functions. We can kind of look at it and understand. We're familiar with, advisory committees, state-based and localised, and so that's not a new thing for a lot of Indigenous communities, particularly when we look at lands councils, AECGs. So I don't think it'll be unlike some of those functions, but absolutely it'll be elected. They will be elected by Indigenous people for Indigenous people, which is a really important thing about the Voice to Parliament.
Yeah, and we do have clear guiding principles, so I can't show them to you on screen, but it's important to go away and maybe have a read of them. So again, the gender equity piece is really important, so equal men and women. The age equity will be important as well, so young people as well as older people. There will be regional and urban, so that all areas geographically are represented, and it will be so grassroots, so local to state to federal. So it's how do we bring the voices of local organisations, bring them through that sort of a democratic system, so that they are represented on the national in the national discussion. So I think that's why. Now, how big the committee will be, there's some principles at the moment, but again, that will depend on the government of the day, which is no different to how big our defence force is, or how many taxes we have, and how, tax commissioners, and a lot of other aspects like that, how many judges we have maybe. So again, the Constitution, you just can't put that level of detail in the Constitution. We don't have it about any other body that is empowered by the Constitution. We don't have that level of detail. And so I think it's really important to put that is in the hands of the government of the day. And if the Australian people aren't happy with the decision of the government of the day, they will vote them out at the next election. And keeping in mind, we have elections every 3 years, so it's pretty quick, the turnaround when it comes to federal elections. Another question. So some of the no arguments. How is a voice superior to what we have already? Well, I think we've kind of touched on that a little bit, plus the fact that we don't technically have an equivalent of the voice, because we've had bodies have been put in place by one government, disbanded by the next, and so then you have that breakdown of continuity, and policies and the programs don't continue. So I think we've probably touched on that question. Already 11 politicians in Parliament. How is the voice superior? I think we've probably touched on that one already. Politicians represent their communities, their electorates, or their, if they're a lower house MP, or if they're upper house MP, it might be a Senate. 30 billion spent on Indigenous needs. Well, again, I won't comment on that number, because I don't know where the nature of that number's come from. And there's been a lot of quite outlandish claims put out there, in fact, about, and as I said, there is no fact checking on a lot of this. But the reality is, if you are a person that is concerned about the cost of particular programs, then I would argue you would want to see effectiveness and advice about those programs. And so the only way we will get more cost effectiveness out of programs is if we have them better tailored and with better prospects of success. And to do that, you need to listen to those that will be impacted by those policies.
I mean, I won't speak to the number, but I've seen firsthand the incredible waste in community, because we see programs, we see dollars, but it's very not often do we see that it reaches where it needs to go. So we don't see the practical outcomes on the ground. The voice to Parliament, there is an economic perspective on why you would vote yes. It means that governments can make better decisions, which means value for money. It means we will see practical results on the ground versus, a waste of public money. We really need to look at it from a practical point of view as well.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the voice will be able to highlight to government which programs are effective and which ones aren't. Absolutely. And so which ones should stop, so that something more effective can be put in place, right? So if you're worried about cost effectiveness, this is a way to actually break the cycle and get more cost effective. Okay, I think that's that question. Why AEC suggests... Oh, the tick and the cross question. Well, there's nothing new about this, right? Referendums these are the same rules for the AEC that have been in place for a long, long time. But the reality is, and if everyone here maybe thinks about, when you fill out a form and you have an option to do a box, some people may tick and some people might cross, but you often will cross a box that you are selecting. And so a selection of a box, so it's not a universal thing to say that a cross means no, because a cross actually often means you are selecting that option, which is why that won't be recognised. I do think Australians are capable of writing a 3-letter word. And so at the end of the day, yes, it's a yes. A tick has been viewed as being recognising as it, because again, you can say yes to on a form in terms of a box. You can say yes via a tick or by crossing that form, and you're still saying yes. So Look, ultimately the advice will be very clear. There will be a lot of volunteers around the booth. The referendum will happen like an election, so there will be pre-polling, there is postal voting open, pre-polling available for 2 weeks, and then the election, the referendum on the 14th. Around Warringah, we will have lots of volunteers, so if you have any questions, ask them. And they will be encouraging everybody to write yes or no. And historically, it's important to know there has been a very low informal vote on referendums. So traditionally, Australians know how to write yes or no. So it's all good. Now, Chloe, yeah, there's some people here would like to know more about your background. They would like to know a bit more about your community and how you feel their lives can be changed by a yes or no vote.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a Wiradjuri Galari woman. I'm from Gilgandra in central west New South Wales. I moved to Sydney about 10 or so years ago. My family come from Gilgandra but also Condobolin, and then the other side of my family are from Walgett. And now these are some of the communities where, like many other communities, have high Indigenous population, and are not without huge disadvantage. Thing that I probably see most regularly is just the lack of opportunity. We see kids, we're encouraging kids to go to school, but when we leave school, and if children make it to year 12, which doesn't happen very often, there is not a lot of opportunities in our towns, in our hometowns. And then, for example, Gilgandra, a lot of it's farm work, seasonal work, and that doesn't offer a lot of stability in communities. Probably most recently, it's been there a long time, but the health crisis in New South Wales particularly. I mean, I had a very close family member just this year have some really huge mental health issues, and I sat in that mental health ward in Dubbo, and every single person that came through that door was an Indigenous person, and I either knew where they were from or knew their family. Dubbo is obviously a really big meeting point. It's a sort of a hub in the central west, and far west families come through there. But I also watched those same people walk out the door, and I was there for quite a number of weeks, and so many of those people came back through. The person I'm really close to went back to Gilgandra, was told to get on the phone, get online. This person, can barely use a mobile phone, but so access to really critical mental health care is just not available. It's just not there. It does not work on the ground, and so we're kind of bringing people through a healthcare system. And trying to really care for them, but it's not because the healthcare professionals aren't good at their jobs. They're absolutely amazing people, but it's just that kind of cultural appropriateness that just isn't linked in.
Yeah.
And again, our communities know what that looks like. Our communities know how that could fit in, but we just haven't quite got there. A really wonderful example of where that works really well is on the Central Coast, out of the Glen Rehab, and they do phenomenal work with Indigenous communities. They aren't an Indigenous specific rehabilitation centre, but they work really closely and embed a lot of the cultural sort of elements to how we would care for people, and their results are just fabulous. So to me, the healthcare and the delivery of culturally appropriate healthcare in far west and central west New South Wales is absolutely critical. But again, we also see some wonderful work out of those communities as well, and I just think that this is going to be one of those moments where we're able to realise our potential. So
yeah, and I think something you said earlier really struck me, the idea that there isn't drinkable water in some communities. Now, we're not talking about some developing nation on some other continent. We're talking about Australia here, where communities don't have drinking water. So how can kids hope to have good health, go to school, pursue their education? Like, these problems all compound each other, and we're setting people up to fail if we're not going to change how things are working. It's really, really important. I think one of the things, if I could say, I'm a big fan of Ted Lasso, for anyone who's watched it, and I always do say to people, be curious, not judgmental. And that's it's a big line in there. And so it's really important to, don't judge from a position of fear, but really be curious and open to what this can change, how it can help, how this can make a difference. This question, why are so many people against the voice? Look, I think there's a lot of uncertainty. There's been a lot of misinformation and lies. There's a lot of fear-mongering of, try and really present the worst case scenario that could possibly be, be imagined. And then you're really appealing to people's fear. But I think Australians are more generous than that. So we have one question, one thing that's conflating different issues that's come up around Aboriginal heritage listing applications in relation to different native title claims, for example. I know locally there's been one around Balmoral, and that's been conflated as somehow there's this fear campaign that if we do constitutional recognition and we have a voice, we're going to lose our land, you're going to lose your house, you're going to, all these things are going to go. That is really disrespectful and just not true. Any claims for Aboriginal heritage listing, and I believe the one in Mossman, for example, in Balmoral, that's been on foot since 2009. It follows its due process. Since the Mabo decision, we have a process of recognising native title and claims. It will happen. If it is a genuine claim, then it has to be recognised. It's not a question of saying somehow if we provide constitutional recognition and listen, that somehow this is going to result in a land grab, right? This is what John Howard said around if we apologise to the stolen generation, that somehow, or after the Mabo decision, that somehow everyone's going to lose their land. It's really appealing to that fear of people, and I think it's really base, it's really low, and it's not founded in fact. It hasn't happened. Comparative countries like I think it's Sweden, Canada, New Zealand, you haven't seen an end to government. The executive has not been stuck in the High Court. You have not seen a loss of land, and what you see is reconciliation. You see a cooperation and a more united nation that recognises its First Peoples. That's all it is. Yeah, I think there's a real fear-mongering about linking all these things, and we've seen that before. We saw that around the Mabo decision. We saw that around the apology to the stolen generation. We saw it around, the same-sex marriage vote, where, the institution of families was going to be demolished if we provided the same rights to everybody, and we haven't seen that. So I think everybody has to have faith and be, be hopeful, be positive, and be, have faith in the Australian people and in the government that you elect to make this work and make it good. Okay, I think we've got a couple more questions. I know it's going quite a while. Why was a referendum not prepared with 2 questions? Because that is the recipe for failure. That's what happened with the referendum question in 1999 around should we become a republic. Again, like I said, there's been a number of referendums and very little changes since 1901, and it all comes down to the complexity of the question. And as soon as you ask numerous questions, you split the answer essentially and make it impossible for it to succeed. And that's why every word in the question that has been put to the Australian people has been very carefully weighed up by our very best constitutional lawyers to make sure that it is effective and meaningful, but not overcomplicated and not with unintended consequences. And I think that's most of the questions. There's one last question. All Australians want their quality of life improved. Absolutely. No one is disputing that. But all Australians can't have their lives lift and progress and be better if we leave First Nations Australians in disadvantage and far, far behind. And so for all those that are focusing on that, and I know for many it's tough at the moment, cost of living, we have huge pressures. But I think I just need to remind everybody is First Nations Australians have that and then some, right? They have those issues as well as they don't even, communities that don't have drinking water, can't finish school, can't access health, a lower life expectancy. So no one is disputing that Australians all want their quality of life improved. We are very focused on that. It's what you elect representatives to do. But that should not mean that we leave anyone behind. And what the referendum is trying to do is to ensure that we stop leaving First Nations Australians behind.
Yeah, beautiful.
So I think we've covered most questions. Thank you everybody for coming in. It's late for a Wednesday night, but it's fantastic. If you have any more questions, please ask. It's really important that everyone knows your vote matters. Your decision really matters. This is not a decision that you take lightly. And holding a referendum is not a decision a government takes lightly. So it's not a question that you're going to have another go at this in a couple of years, right? It's taken 6 years since the Uluru Statement to get to a referendum. This is a once in a generation opportunity to take that next step of reconciliation. So I urge everybody to really think about it, know that your decision matters, and ask if you have any questions. If in doubt, find out. Chloe, I think you need to have the last word.
Yeah, look, well, I think I also want to acknowledge all of the incredible volunteers, particularly
Yes.
here on the northern beaches. We see you everywhere. The volunteers are quite literally the heart and soul of this campaign. We could not do it without you. We've got a growing list of upwards of, I think it's maybe 38,000 now volunteers, and that number grows by the thousands every week. And so we've got volunteers out there every single day, handing out flyers at train stations, knocking on doors every single day between now and the 14th of October, and it is just incredible to see. Look, there is a lot of noise, but it is very different, the conversations that we're having on the ground. So I encourage everybody to have more conversations with your family, your friends, your colleagues, and if you're unsure, you have questions, reach out and engage with the campaign. We're here to help, and look, it is quite a simple proposition, and I'm very, very confident that come 14th of October, Australians will come together and unite and vote yes. So thank you very much.
Thanks everyone.